I should have never come back to my grandparents' old hunting lodge in rural Maine. The place has been abandoned for decades, swallowed by the trees and silence. But the second I stepped onto that rotting porch, I could feel the woods holding its breath. My grandfather always said there were rules, strange rules, that kept the place safe, rules I thought were just the ramblings of an old man. But last night, while unpacking, I saw something move in the reflection of the window. Not outside, not inside either, but in the glass itself. Pause. And now, I'm starting to think those rules weren't warnings. They were survival instructions. Slow, tense tone, and breaking even one of them means you'll never leave these woods alive. That I parked my car at the end of a long dirt road that looked more like an animal trail than anything fit for tires, and for a moment I just sat there, with the engine idling, staring through the cracked windshield at the trees pressing in on either side. Rural Maine has a way of making you feel like you've stumbled out of time, like the forest never got the memo that people existed at all. And as I killed the ignition and the headlights faded out, I realized the silence was absolute. No crickets, no wind moving through the pines, no distant hum of traffic, just me and the weight of the woods pressing against the car windows. My grandparents' hunting lodge sat about a quarter-mile up from here, but the road had long been swallowed by undergrowth and the creeping advance of birch saplings. So I had no choice but to haul my duffel bag and flashlight up the path that looked less like a road and more like a scar carved into the forest decades ago. I could remember coming here as a kid, maybe 8 or 9, trailing behind my grandfather as he stomped up the path with his old hunting rifle slung across his back. And even then I hated the place. It wasn't just the smell of mildew and smoke, or the way the antlers nailed above the door seemed to stare at you no matter where you moved. It was the rules he kept muttering about, half under his breath, as if saying them out loud might call something out from the trees that he never wrote them down, at least not that I ever saw. But I heard them enough times, repeated in that same flat voice, that they wormed their way into my head. Never whistle after dark. Never open the basement door. Never leave food uncovered overnight. At the time, I thought they were just strict house rules, the kind of nonsense adults invent to keep kids from wandering or making trouble. But then, one night, I broke one. I whistled, just once, while brushing my teeth in the upstairs bathroom. Within seconds, the air in the lodge changed. The floorboards creaked in patterns that didn't match footsteps. The smell of smoke and wet earth filled the air, and when I looked out the window toward the tree line, I swear I saw shapes, tall, thin shapes, standing in between the trunks, perfectly still, as though they'd been waiting for me. My grandfather didn't yell when he found me pale and shaking the next morning. He just put a hand on my shoulder, leaned down, and whispered, "That's the last time you'll forget." And I never whistled again. Now, decades later, with both of my grandparents long buried and the lodge abandoned, I had to wonder why the memory of that warning came back to me so clearly as I trudged through the damp undergrowth. The place had been sitting empty since my grandfather passed, but the deed had landed in my lap after a mess of probate paperwork, and I figured I'd drive up and take a look before deciding whether to sell it. Maybe a part of me even wanted to prove something to myself, that it had all been childhood imagination, that the rules were nothing more than an old man's eccentricities. But as the silhouette of the lodge appeared between the trees, slouched and sagging like an animal carcass left to rot, the unease that had been building in my stomach tightened into something heavier. The hunting lodge wasn't much. 2 stories, a slanted tin roof, a porch with missing planks, and dark windows like eyes that had been blindfolded with grime. The door was still there, though the wood was warped and the antlers nailed above it had lost one of their points, leaving them jagged and lopsided. My flashlight beam swept across the exterior, catching peeling paint and the remnants of old traps hanging from nails hammered into the siding. The smell hit me before I even touched the door handle. Damp, sour, and faintly metallic, like rust and blood mixed together. It was the smell of a place that had been sealed up too long, that had secrets sweating out through its pores. Inside, the air was heavier still, the kind that stuck to your skin and clung in your throat. The first floor was just as I remembered. A main room with a stone fireplace, animal heads mounted above it, an old sofa sagging in the middle, and a table scarred with knife marks and cigarette burns. My grandfather's hunting gear still hung on pegs near the door, though the leather, was cracked and the rifles had long since been removed, probably by my uncle before he moved away. Dust coated everything in a thick gray film, disturbed only by the trail I left with my boots. And when I brushed my hand across the back of a chair, the residue clung like ash. But it wasn't the dust or the smell that unsettled me most. It was the fact that the place didn't feel empty. The silence wasn't natural. It felt occupied, like someone or something was holding its breath in the corners, waiting for me to move. That I dropped my bag on the sofa and tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just nostalgia twisted by time. But as the hours passed, the lodge didn't grow any friendlier. Every creak of the beams sounded deliberate. Every shift of the shadows in the firelight felt watchful, and every time I glanced toward the hallway that led to the basement door, I half expected to see it cracked open. I hadn't even thought of the basement in years, but the memory of that rule, never open the basement door, rose up in my mind like a bubble breaking the surface of water. Why would my grandfather make a rule like that unless he had a reason? And why did I feel, even now, that if I reached for that knob, something on the other side would already be reaching back? The night pressed in harder than I remembered, the kind of rural dark that swallows light whole. The woods beyond the window were ink black, the tree line a wall of shadow. I made myself a fire in the hearth, the flames throwing long, twitching shapes across the walls, and tried to ignore the way the mounted deer head above the mantel seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. Maybe it was just the firelight. Maybe it was just me. But deep down, I already knew. The rules hadn't died with my grandfather. They were waiting, dormant, the way the forest waits under snow until spring brings it back to life. And now that I was here, now that I had stepped into this place again, the rules were watching me, waiting for me to remember or to fail. The first night in the lodge stretched on longer than any night I'd had in years. And when I finally drifted into a fitful sleep on the lumpy sofa with the fire burning low, I woke up sometime around 3 in the morning to the sound of knocking. Not loud, not frantic, but steady and deliberate, like knuckles rapping against wood in a slow rhythm that seemed meant for me alone. And as I lay there with my eyes half open, I realized it wasn't coming from the front door or the porch, but from somewhere inside the house, deeper, like the walls themselves had hollowed out and grown fists. I sat up, heart hammering, and the fire had burned down to embers, so the room was awash in a dull red glow, shadows twitching across the animal heads on the wall as though they were alive and restless. And for the first time I noticed that the mounted deer head's eyes were glinting, not like glass catching firelight, but wet, as if something living was behind them, watching me. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam slicing through dust and gloom, and forced myself to whisper that it was nothing, just the old wood shifting. But then I caught the faintest shuffle of movement in the hallway toward the basement door, like someone dragging their feet just out of sight. Every nerve in me screamed to get out, to leave, to drive until I saw the first street light of civilization. But something in me, the same stubborn, self-destructive part that had brought me back here in the first place, told me that I had to stay, that leaving now would mean never knowing why my grandfather had been so obsessed with his rules, never knowing what exactly lived in the marrow of this house. The morning did nothing to wash away that dread. If anything, daylight made the lodge look even worse, with peeling wallpaper curling like dead skin and the smell of mold seeping up through the floorboards. And as I boiled water on the old wood stove for coffee, I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see a pale face pressed to the glass from the outside. The woods beyond were silent still, no birdsong, no rustle of small animals, just a vast, oppressive stillness that made me feel like I was being studied. I tried walking the property, tracing the old paths my grandfather used to cut through the underbrush, and every so often I'd find relics. A rusted bear trap half buried in the soil, a length of rope hanging from a tree branch like it had been used to drag something heavy, claw marks etched deep into the bark of a pine that stood taller than any ladder could reach. The air grew colder the further I went from the cabin, a clammy chill that sank into my bones even though the calendar still insisted it was early fall. And when I finally circled back, I was struck by the way the lodge looked from a distance. Hunched low between the trees, the antlers nailed above the door crooked like horns. It didn't look like a place someone had built. It looked like something the forest had coughed up some growth it had been trying to get rid of. That second night, I tried to read to distract myself, an old paperback I'd found left behind on the shelf, but the words kept blurring on the page. My attention yanked back to the smallest sounds. A faint creak upstairs when no one should be there. The snap of a twig outside the window when the nearest path was a mile away. The almost imperceptible tick of nails scratching wood that always seemed to fade when I raised the flashlight. Around midnight, I made the mistake of dozing off, and when I woke again, my throat dry, I saw something that made me wish I hadn't come at all. The basement door, the one that had been shut tight since I arrived, was now open just a fraction, a sliver of blackness leaking out into the hall. I froze, staring, trying to convince myself I had left it that way, but deep down I knew better. The air spilling from that gap was colder than the rest of the room, carrying a faint smell of wet soil and something coppery, and though I couldn't hear anything, I felt the heavy awareness of something crouched just beyond my sight, waiting for me to move closer. I slammed it shut without thinking, and the second the wood met the frame, the silence inside the lodge deepened, like the whole house exhaled in relief or disappointment. From that night forward, I kept the fire burning higher, the flashlight closer, but the lodge had decided it wasn't going to let me settle easy. On the third morning, I woke to find my boots moved from where I'd left them beside the door to halfway across the room. The laces knotted together in a complicated twist I couldn't have tied if I tried. And though I laughed nervously to myself and muttered that I must have done it in my sleep, the back of my neck prickled with the certainty that I hadn't. Later, while unpacking some food, I left a loaf of bread on the counter while I rummaged in my bag, and when I turned back barely a minute later, the plastic was torn open, crumbs scattered, and wet streaks like saliva glistened across the wood. Only there hadn't been a sound. No rustle, no chewing, just the aftermath as if the act itself had been erased from time. My grandfather's warnings drifted back, sharper now, echoing with meaning I didn't want to admit. Don't leave food uncovered overnight. Don't open the basement door. Don't whistle after dark. They weren't just his quirks. They were rules. And already, I could feel myself slipping closer to breaking them. Every evening the forest pressed in tighter, as though the trees were leaning closer to listen, and by the end of that week I started hearing whispers, thin, almost childlike, threading, through the crackle of the fire and the groans of the house. They never came from a direction I could pinpoint, but always near, just out of reach, and though the words were too faint to understand, the tone was pleading, coaxing, like something wanted me to answer. I bit my tongue bloody to keep from responding, terrified that if I did, they'd hear me and know I was listening. At first I thought the isolation was getting to me, some mix of bad sleep and paranoia, but the lodge wasn't simply old wood and stone. It was alive in the way a trap is alive, patient and waiting, and now that I had set foot inside, it was tightening. Still, I told myself I could handle it, that I'd stay a few more days, maybe clear out some of the junk to prepare for a sale, and then leave this place forever. But even as I convinced myself of that plan, I began noticing things that made leaving feel less possible, as though the house itself was sabotaging me. The car keys I swore I'd left in my bag vanished, only to reappear 2 days later on the mantel above the fireplace. The path back to where I'd parked was so overgrown I could no longer even find the spot where the dirt road had ended. My phone, fully charged when I arrived, drained itself within minutes every time I tried to use it. It was as though the lodge and the woods around it had reached out with invisible fingers, stripping away the exit routes one by one. And all the while the memory of my grandfather's whisper lodged itself deeper into my mind, his voice low, rough with fear, telling me there are rules, and the rules are the only reason you survive. I didn't know them all yet. I didn't know why they existed, or what waited for me if I broke them. But by then, I had already begun to realize that the lodge wasn't giving me a choice. I was going to learn the rules, one way or another, and the lessons would not be gentle. Pause, low voice. The problem was, I didn't know if I was already too late. It was on the fifth night, when the whispers had grown so constant that I'd begun stuffing my ears with crumpled tissues just to snatch a few moments of peace, that I finally found the notebook, a battered leather-bound thing wedged deep behind. A loose plank in the floor beneath the sofa, and the second I touched it I knew it was my grandfather's, though the sight of his handwriting crawling across those yellowed pages made my stomach twist because the letters were jagged, frantic. The script of a man writing faster than his sanity could keep up. The first pages were nothing but scattered notes, sketches of the forest, crude drawings of antlers and eyes and doorways drawn black until the paper tore. But then, further in, there it was, a list, numbered, precise, underlined in places where the ink had bled, and though my breath caught as I read, part of me wasn't even surprised because deep down I had always known the rules were real, that they were more than muttered warnings. This was the scripture of the lodge, the survival guide, the instructions left behind for whoever was foolish enough to come after him. The first line stopped me cold. Rule 1, never whistle after dark. They mistake it for an invitation. My skin prickled as the memory of that childhood slip flooded back. The creaking floorboards, the shapes in the trees, the way my grandfather's voice shook when he told me never again. And seeing it there in black and white turned my unease into certainty. It hadn't been imagination. It hadn't been fear. It had been the first proof. I read on with my hands trembling, each sentence heavier than the last. Rule 2. Keep every window covered before nightfall. If they see the fire, they will circle closer. I thought of the way the darkness pressed against the glass each night, how I'd caught faint glints like eyes in the black, and realized I had already broken this one more than once. Rule 3. Do not leave food uncovered overnight. The hungry ones are always listening. My mind flashed back to the torn bread bag, the wet streaks, the silence that followed. Rule 4. The basement door must never be opened. What lives beneath does not belong to us anymore. A shiver rattled through me because I could still feel the cold draft spilling from that crack, still see the blackness that looked thicker than shadow. Rule 5. If you hear knocking from inside, do not answer. It is not knocking, it is asking. My mouth went dry at that one, remembering the deliberate rhythm that had pulled me from sleep. Rule 6. Between midnight and 3 a.m., do not look into the mirrors. They remember faces that no longer live. I thought of the window reflection I had seen that first night, something moving in the glass that hadn't been in the room, and my gut clenched. Rule 7. If you must go outside, carry salt in your pockets and do not step off the path, no matter what you hear calling your name. The memory of the claw marks on the tree and the suffocating chill between the trunks returned like a punch. Rule 8. Never sleep in the upstairs bedroom. That room belongs to her now. The word her was written heavier, pressed so hard the pen had torn through the paper, and I felt a wave of nausea because I knew exactly which room he meant, the one with the broken rocking chair, the one I had avoided without knowing why. Rule 9. When the deer head above the fireplace turns its gaze, do not acknowledge it. Pretend you do not see. To see is to be seen. I thought of the glint in its eyes, how it had felt alive. Rule 10. At dawn, leave an offering on the porch, tobacco, alcohol, or blood. They must be fed, or the woods will take their own. The words sent a cold weight settling in my chest, because in the pit of my memory, I could see my grandfather every morning, stepping out onto that crooked porch with something cupped in his hands, muttering words I had never understood. And finally, Rule 11. If you survive until sunrise on the 7th night, leave. Do not return. The lodge does not let go twice. That last one made my hands go slack, the notebook sliding onto the dusty floor, because I realized I was only 2 nights away from that deadline. And already I had broken at least 3 rules. The air in the room seemed to thicken as I whispered them aloud, the numbers and warnings stringing together like chains around my chest. And for a moment I swore I heard something upstairs shift in response, as if acknowledging that I finally knew, as if the house itself had been waiting for me to read the scripture it had demanded. The fire popped, a spark leaping into the darkness, and I told myself I would follow them now, every single one, because to ignore them was no longer an option. Yet even as I said it, I felt that same gnawing certainty that had been growing since the moment I set foot on the porch, that rules, by their nature, exist to be broken, and that this place had been waiting years for me to break the right one. I told myself I'd follow the rules, every single one, that I'd cling to them like a lifeline. But the truth is the lodge seemed designed to make me fail, like some cruel test where every choice was rigged, and the first slip happened the very same night I found the notebook. When the fire began to gutter low around 1 in the morning, and I stood to feed it more wood, glancing toward the covered windows just to reassure myself, only to see that one of the blankets I'd nailed up had sagged and slipped, leaving a bare corner of glass exposed to the night. And in that thin triangle of reflection, I saw movement. No, not movement. Arrangement. Shapes gathering at the edge of the trees, tall and narrow, bending like reeds in wind that didn't exist. And though I dropped the blanket back into place as fast as I could, heart thundering, the damage was already done, because for the rest of the night I could hear them, faint crunches of snowless steps around the house, circling, like sharks scenting blood. The next day I tried to repair the coverings, but the nails bent or snapped in my hands, the wood splitting like the house itself was resisting my attempts to make it safe. And when I finally managed to hang the last blanket, I found myself staring at the deer head above the fireplace again, its glassy eyes reflecting the fire, and for the briefest instant, so quick I wanted to deny it, I saw them swivel, locking onto me, tracking me as I moved, and against every instinct I almost acknowledged. It almost whispered, "I see you," before biting my tongue until it bled and forcing myself to look away. The lodge wanted me to fail. It wanted me to break the rules, and the longer I stayed, the harder it became to tell whether it was me making mistakes or the house arranging them for me. That night, I remembered the rule about mirrors and caught myself halfway up the stairs, my hand brushing the frame of the bathroom door, and the impulse to flick the switch just to see, just to prove there was nothing there, was almost unbearable. Like the mirror itself was humming behind the door, calling me, promising answers if I'd only dare, and it was only the sound of faint knocking, steady, deliberate, coming from the basement door, that broke me from the trance and sent me stumbling back down the stairs, hands shaking so bad I nearly dropped the flashlight. I sat in front of the fire for hours, whispering the rules to myself like prayers, rocking back and forth as the knocks continued, patient, polite, like whatever was inside had all the time in the world. The fourth night was worse, because exhaustion made me careless, and careless is fatal in that house. I had been so focused on the windows and the basement door that I forgot about the food, left the remnants of my dinner, a can of beans and some jerky, sitting on the table when I dozed off by the fire. And when I woke again, the first thing I noticed was the smell, damp and sour, and the second was the silence, thicker than it had ever been, pressing on my ears until I realized I could hear something faint beneath it. Chewing. Slow, wet chewing. My eyes darted to the table and my stomach clenched because the food was gone. The kin licked clean, and smeared across the wood was a trail of something darker than saliva, streaks that looked red in the firelight, but smelled like copper and earth. The chewing continued, but it wasn't in the room. It was behind the walls, above the ceiling, below the floorboards, moving all around me as if the house itself had grown teeth. I didn't sleep at all after that, just sat with the poker in my hand and the rules looping in my mind, over and over, but it didn't matter because the next morning I discovered that my boots were missing again, and when I finally found them hours later, tucked neatly by the porch, they were filled with fresh soil, wet and black, as though someone or something had carried them deep into the earth before returning them. That day, for the first time, I thought about the seventh night warning in my grandfather's notes. If you survive until sunrise on the seventh night, leave, do not return. The lodge does not let go twice. And the thought that I might not make it that far dug into me like a splintered by the fifth night. The lodge wasn't waiting for me to break rules anymore. It was bending reality, forcing me into traps. I was sitting by the fire, whispering the rules aloud like a lunatic, when I heard it, my name, spoken in my grandfather's voice, drifting in through the crack between the door and its frame. My blood froze because I knew the rule about the path, about voices calling your name. But this wasn't outside in the woods. It was inside, right at the threshold, the same voice that had once guided me through these very halls, and it begged me, soft and trembling, to open the door. I sat there for what felt like hours, sweating, tears running down my face, repeating, "Do not answer, do not answer, do not answer," until finally the voice stopped and the silence returned, heavier than before, as if the house itself was disappointed. Later that night, while pacing the room to stay awake, I tripped over my own duffel bag and spilled its contents across the floor, and that's when I realized with horror that the small pocket knife I'd brought had gone missing, vanished without a trace, though I hadn't touched it in days. In its place, resting neatly on top of my clothes, was something I hadn't seen since childhood: my grandfather's old tobacco pouch, worn smooth, filled fresh as if he had just set it down. My skin crawled at the sight of it, because I understood. The message, Rule 10, at dawn, leave an offering on the porch, and though I hadn't intended to follow that one, the lodge had provided me the means. Pushing me toward compliance like a shepherd herding livestock, I could feel the seventh night looming, pressing down on me like a storm that hadn't yet broken, and as I sat in the glow of the fire with the tobacco pouch clutched in my hands, I knew the rules were no longer just warnings. They were bargains, negotiations with whatever owned this place, and I had already broken too many to walk away untouched. The question wasn't if I would fail again, it was how and when, and what the cost would be when I did. And as I whispered the rules one last time before the dawn bled gray through the cracks in the shutters, I realized with hollow certainty that the lodge wasn't teaching me survival at all. It was teaching me obedience, and every broken rule wasn't an accident, but an initiation. Pause, slow voice. The real question was whether I'd survive long enough to learn what I was being initiated into. I never thought there could be a night worse than the last one. But Chapter 5 of this cursed existence I've found myself trapped in proved me wrong from the very first second it began, because by the time I walked through the rotting doorframe of the station house, I felt like my skin no longer belonged to me, as though something had peeled me back, hollowed me out, and then shoved me forward to keep walking like a meat puppet who knew the rules but no longer understood why he was following them. And as I clocked in and saw the list, yes, the list had changed again. More rules, longer, some crossed out, in that same smeared black ink, and others scrawled freshly as if written while the paper bled. I realized that whatever force authored those rules wasn't just watching me. It was anticipating me, adjusting the game as it went, making sure that I would never, not once, feel like I had even the faintest chance of winning. And as I scanned down the numbered commandments, the bile rose in my throat because there were 3 new ones, all worse than anything that had come before. One stating, if you hear someone you love calling for help, do not respond. It is not them. Another, at exactly 2:33 a.m. you must cover every reflective surface in the station house or risk seeing what's really behind you. And the last, scribbled so violently into the page the words almost cut through, under no circumstance should you attempt to leave before sunrise, which told me in no uncertain terms that my earlier fantasies of just running, of just bolting into the woods, were nothing more than bait on the hook, a trick they wanted me to try so they could drag me deeper into the maw. And I remember leaning against the wall, feeling the sweat sting my eyes, the pulse hammer in my temples, and thinking about the face of my mother, her voice, how it would sound if they chose to use it against me, because that's what this was now. Not just a series of rules to follow, but a full-scale war against my memories, my instincts, my very sense of self. And as the clock ticked past midnight, the silence of the station house thickened like wet tar, every corner heavy with expectation. The air humming with something too low to hear, but too heavy not to feel. And it began, as always, with the scratching. Only this time it wasn't at the door. It was inside, right there in the same room as me, behind the vending machine that hadn't worked in years, the sound of nails dragging against metal, slow, deliberate, like someone carving tally marks into the bones of time itself. And when I stepped closer, when I held my flashlight up, the beam flickered as though trying to die, and in that dying glow I saw, not movement exactly, but the shadow of something that didn't match the shape of the vending machine, an outline with too many joints, crouched and waiting. And I remembered the rule about never engaging what I couldn't clearly see. So I backed away, every nerve in my body screaming to run, but knowing I couldn't, not yet. And I sat back down at the guard desk, my breath ragged, listening as the scratching grew louder, closer, then stopped, replaced by the sound of my own voice calling my name, begging me to help, to open the back door. And I pressed my palms against my ears, trying to shut it out, but the voice seeped through my skin, into my bones, and I almost cracked, almost got up, almost broke the new rule. within the first hour, but something in me, maybe fear, maybe some thin ribbon of stubbornness, held me to the chair, held me in place until the voice finally broke into sobbing, then silence. And I knew then that this night was going to hollow me out completely, because if they could twist my own voice into bait, then nothing was safe, nothing was real, and still the minutes dragged on, each one longer than the last, until the clock ticked over to 2:33 a.m. and I knew what I had to do. So I scrambled around the station house, ripping old newspaper from the recycling bin, tearing cloth from forgotten rags, draping them over every mirror, every shard of glass, every reflective surface I could find, even the polished badge on the locker wall. And yet as I worked, I caught glimpses out of the corner of my eye, faces, mine but not mine, looking back at me from the reflections, grinning with mouths too wide, eyes too black. And each time I turned my head, they were gone. But the more I covered, the stronger the sense that something was standing just behind me grew, until by the time I slapped the last sheet of newspaper over the bathroom mirror, my heart was a jackhammer, and my vision swam, and I knew if I dared look into a reflection again, I'd see it fully, whatever it was, and I would not come back from that. So I sat in the dark, every window shrouded, every mirror buried, the station house now a coffin with me inside, and I waited, hours dripping by like blood from an open vein, until the knocking started, not at the door this time, but at the walls, rhythmic, measured, the sound of knuckles on wood, moving from one side of the building to the other, circling me, mocking me, until it stopped right behind my chair, and I felt hot breath against my ear and a voice whisper, "You won't make it to sunrise." And my vision went black for a moment, the world swimming out of focus, and when I blinked, when I came back, the clock said 4 a.m. and the station house was utterly silent, as though none of it had happened. And that was almost worse, because now I didn't trust the passage of time itself, didn't trust my own memory, and still I sat there, shaking, waiting, until finally the first cracks of dawn bled weakly into the horizon, the sunlight seeping through the cracks in the paper I'd plastered over the windows, and only then, only when the station house sighed like a dying thing letting me go, did I realize I'd survived another night. But at what cost? Because I no longer felt like a man, no longer felt like myself, just an echo waiting for the next sundown to drag me back into the nightmare again. The lighthouse groans around me like a dying beast, its stone bones cracking under the relentless assault of the storm that has raged now for what feels like centuries, though my watch insists only hours have passed. Yet I know time here has. Broken, split, shattered like a glass dropped into the sea and scattered across 1,000 impossible realities, each one bleeding into this night, each one whispering a truth I wish I'd never learned, but cannot unhear, cannot escape. And as I stagger through the spiraling stairwell, soaked to the marrow, skin blistered from the cold salt spray that seeps even through stone, I understand finally, fully, that the rules I was given were never for survival, they were for containment. Fragile instructions meant not to keep me alive, but to slow the unraveling of something far larger than myself, something ancient and patient and inevitable that has lived beneath these waves since before language, before fire, before light, waiting for the moment when a fool like me would fumble the fragile rituals of obedience and let it in, not just into the lighthouse, but into the marrow of my soul, into the bones of this earth itself. And now the rules are dust, useless scraps of paper drowned in the dark, and all I can do is keep walking upward, each step heavier than the last, as if the weight of the entire ocean is pressing down upon me, as if the lighthouse itself wishes to keep me here, to lock me in its spiral forever, a moth trapped in its glass throat while the lantern burns above, not a light anymore, but a wound in reality itself, bleeding a pale, pulsing glow that makes the storm freeze and flicker, a strobe light tearing through the fabric of the sky, showing glimpses of things that do not belong in this world, towering shapes half submerged, claws dragging through the waves, eyes larger, then houses opening and closing in rhythm with the crashing surf. And every time the light sweeps, I see more, closer, clearer, until I realize the sea itself is not water but flesh, that every wave is a breath, every ripple a muscle twitch. And I am standing on the skin of something alive, something so vast my mind cracks just trying to hold the thought. But still I climb, still I reach, because if I stop, the stairs will swallow me. The shadows between the steps will yawn wider, and I will tumble into the infinite abyss that waits. Below, where the drowned keep whispering, keep chanting, their voices crawling up the stone walls like mildew, calling my name in syllables stretched too long, too wet. And though I try to cover my ears, the sound vibrates through my skull, through my teeth, until my jaw aches from the pressure, and then I reach the final landing, the lantern chamber, the heart of it all, and I know this is where I was always meant to end, that this was never a job, never a shift, never even a test. It was a summoning, a sacrifice, and I am the last piece of it, the willing fool who signed my name to a contract of obedience that was never meant to protect me, only to bind me long enough to guide me here, where the lens turns not outward but inward, magnifying not the sea but the self, reflecting not light but hunger. And as I step into the chamber, the storm falls silent, the waves freeze mid-crash. The entire world holds its breath as the lantern spins one last time and catches me in its beam, searing through flesh, peeling away skin, burning away every lie I ever told myself about escape, about survival, about hope. And I see then that I was never meant to leave, that the others who came before me never left either, that their shadows are here still, fused into the glass, their faces stretched and screaming across the lens, their eyes blind but endless, and now I am among them. My own reflection splitting, warping, merging with theirs as the light drills into me, carving my soul out like marrow from a bone. And though I want to scream, to fight, my voice is gone, stolen, absorbed into the chorus that hums through the tower, a hymn of hunger, of eternity, of the deep. And I understand in that last flicker of self that this is not an ending but a continuation, that the lighthouse will always need a keeper, and now I am part of it, not alive, not dead, but woven into its beam, waiting, watching, calling for the next fool to walk the spiral stairs, the next desperate soul to follow the rules that mean nothing, the next trembling hand to keep the light turning, to keep the hunger fed, because the sea will never stop, the thing beneath will never sleep, and the light must always burn, always beckon, until the world itself drowns in its glow. And so if you're hearing this, if you think you might take my place, remember my words and know that there is no escape, no salvation, no hope, only the inevitable pull of the beam. And when it finds you, when it sweeps across your face in the dark, you'll understand too, and you'll climb, just like I did, step by step, into the mouth of the light, into the wound in the sky, into the end that never ends.